Hello. Welcome to the Pirate History Podcast. Probably the most prominent figure in the story of New England during the 1680s was Governor Edmund Andros. He was appointed to serve as the first governor of New York upon England's acquisition of the territory from the Dutch. It's a bit surprising, to me at least, that he was appointed by the Duke of York, James Stuart. Governor Andros was a staunch Anglican, while James, unofficially at the time, was not. However, this was an excellent compromise. New England was still very Puritan. We're creeping up on the Salem witch trials here. Appointing someone who shared James' beliefs would have resulted in, well, probably in a dead governor floating in the harbor. On the other hand, an avid Anglican could curb some of the more radical Puritan ideas in the colonies. Andros, who was doing a good job in James' eyes, was given full gubernatorial control of the northern and middle colonies, and it was called the Dominion of New England. The colony of New York, which at the time included New Jersey and parts of Delaware, was combined with the Massachusetts Bay Colony, including Maine and Connecticut. Add to that New Hampshire, Plymouth, and Rhode Island, and you have what was the consolidated Dominion of New England, all under Governor Edmund Andros. Needless to say, this reconfiguration rubbed a lot of people the wrong way. Rhode Island and New Hampshire were specifically created to avoid the influence of Massachusetts. It's not strong enough to say that this rubbed people the wrong way. The people of New England hated Edmund Andros. He enforced the Navigation Acts with an iron hand. His rule was labeled authoritarian. The reign of Edmund Andros very nearly led to an American Revolution almost 100 years early. But then came November 1688, the Glorious Revolution. James II was out, William III was in. And in the chaos that follows any transfer of power in the early modern world, the people of America saw their opportunity to rise up. This is episode 167, A Limping Privateer. In January 1689, Governor Edmund Andros received a letter from none other than King James. Andros was in the middle of military preparations for a conflict that was looming over New England, a conflict with the French and their Indian allies to the north. It was a serious concern. In that letter, though, James told Governor Andros to put all of that on the back burner. Right now, the real concern was the Dutch naval buildup. It was clear that the Dutch were preparing for a fight, probably something like the Fourth Anglo-Dutch War, and James expected the Dutch to strike at New York in a bid to reclaim their lost territory. To be fair to James, that is what conventional military wisdom and most of his advisors said would happen. It wasn't what happened, though, obviously. When Governor Andros received that letter in January 1689, James was no longer king. William was already in control of England. But Andros had no way to know that. He prepared for war. He intended to fight a defensive campaign, to repulse any outside invaders that should test his borders, be they Dutch or French or Indian. What he did not expect was that the attack would come from within. About a month after receiving that letter from the king, a Royal Navy ship arrived in port. It was bearing news that King James had been deposed and was currently living in exile. That ship carried orders as well, and they proved to be big. Immediately following the Revolution, William saw to an overhaul of the military. We discussed some of that last time in Marlborough's upgrade to flintlock muskets. But the colonial and naval military overhaul was more difficult. The distance was a problem, as well as the independent minds of many of the colonials. Royal Navy agents who had been appointed by William, staunch Williamites all, were in for quite a job in this reorganization. The Royal Navy had largely been built by three men: Sir Anthony Deane, a maritime architect, Samuel Pepys, and the former Lord High Admiral James II. Now, I've neglected talking much about Samuel Pepys on this show, and that's something I'll have to amend one day. His diary alone is the primary source for the lion's share of English politics throughout this era. His naval reforms built the Royal Navy. The administrators sent to reform the Navy wanted to keep those reforms in place. What they didn't want were the officers that were deemed too loyal to King James. Andros, despite having been appointed by King James, found himself less and less in line with the king's politics. By this point, he was almost an open opponent of the king's. He was happy to help these Royal Navy agents in their quest. On all of the ships in the New England Armada, every officer was reviewed and, if deemed necessary, replaced. And this wasn't just New England, it was happening everywhere, from Bermuda to Jamaica to India. These reforms shook the Royal Navy, and it took a minute for the hangover to wear off. But when they came out the other side, the Navy was younger and hungrier and more willing to adopt some of the wild naval tactics that would carry the British Empire all the way through the Age of Sail. One of the casualties of this purge was Captain Thomas Pound. Pound was a good kingsman, as we may have mentioned. His politics were open. He wore them on his sleeve, and due to that he was removed from command as captain, which might seem kind of strange. After all, Governor Andros oversaw many of the events we talked about when we introduced Thomas Pound. When the Sally Rose was scuttled in a firefight with George Peterson, pirate, it was Governor Andros that levied the tax to pay for Pound's new ship, the Mary. He supported Thomas Pound. But the tide at this point had turned. William was king. He wanted new blood in the Navy, and the governor wasn't going to try to fight that. Captain Pound was replaced as captain of the Mary by John George. Now, Pound wasn't discharged from service. The Navy wasn't foolish enough to fire experienced captain. Instead, Captain Pound, former Captain Pound, and all of the others like him were beached. They were removed from command and left to rest on their laurels. All this while King William III embarked on the greatest war of a generation. It's a sound policy, removing commanders with questionable loyalty at the outbreak of war. You don't want the Navy to mutiny and defect to the enemy in wartime. But also you don't want to lose the capability to activate those experienced commanders should the need arise. So you continue to pay them a stipend, obviously, enough to live on. Otherwise, they'll very likely go rogue and turn pirate. Still, Thomas Pound and the men like him were left shorebound with nothing to do but drink away their idleness and their resentment. In the meantime, Governor Andros was busy putting out fires. It's to be expected in the wake of any major political upheavals. In this case, the biggest fire was a mutiny led by the militia garrison in the province of Maine. This mutiny wasn't political, though not exactly. It was much more personal. It was a redress of grievances. Andros, in his war preparations, mandated that the militia train and drill in a grueling schedule. They were commanded in these drills by Army regulars. But remember, these militiamen were farmers. They were fishermen. They had responsibilities outside the militia, but whenever they complained, they received military discipline. We're talking stockades and beatings, everything you imagine when you think about early modern military discipline. When I call Andros authoritarian, that's what I'm talking about. The governor spent about 2 months in Maine, trying to collar the mutineers without, just opening fire on them. But he had to leave the Maine garrison in March of 1689 when he heard that events in Boston were growing dangerous. It had been quite some time since Andros had been to Boston, beyond just passing through. His residence was in New York, along with his family, which was a change of pace for Boston, not being the most prominent capital in the region. Boston was, as historians are so fond of labeling things, a powder keg. Andros and his men arrived at Boston on the 16th of April, 1689. He and his men made camp at Fort Mary, a large defensible fortification. While there, Andros penned a couple of letters. In one of those, he wrote to his top military commander, still in Maine, quote, "There is a general buzzing among the people of Boston, great with expectation of their old charter." End quote. That's to say that the people of Boston were advocating for their pre-Dominion government of Massachusetts. The people there in Boston believed that the governor was involved in what they called a popish plot. At least that's the justification they would later give. And it could be true. Governor Andros might have been a secret Jacobite. I don't believe that, but it is possible. Still, the people of Boston, who by and large supported the revolution of William III, used it as a rallying cry against Governor Edmund Andros. And even if it wasn't true, even if Andros was not a Jacobite, it was still a smart move to talk about this popish plot. It gave the people who were about to engage in rebellion some legal recourse for the backlash that would likely follow. At 5 a.m. on 18th April, 1689, the people of Boston made their move. A militia force gathered across the river from Boston proper, and about half of them rode into the city. Their first move, as the sun was only just beginning to peek over the horizon, was to invade the homes of regimental drummers and confiscate their equipment. Now that might seem a bit odd, but think about every Revolutionary War reenactment you've ever seen. They always have drummers at the fore. It was important. It was the drummers, though, the militia drummers, that alerted the people of Boston that something was afoot. The people began poking their heads out to see what was amiss and realized that the rebellion was on. Men and women all throughout the city grabbed their guns and their torches and their pitchforks and joined the fight. The first man to be detained by the mob was the captain of the HMS Mary, John George. It just makes good tactical sense. Obviously, you want to arrest the guy that has two first names because you can't trust those people, if you could even call them people. Plus, the Mary was the only Royal Navy ship in port, and it was Boston's probably third greatest military asset. It would also be easy to capture by arresting John George. His crew did not support Andros, just like the rest of them. Now, I can't find any evidence that Thomas Pound was indeed involved in this uprising. It would be a surprise to me to find out that he wasn't on some level, but we don't know. I do like to imagine him, though, personally arresting Captain John George and offering up some witty quip. The rest of the day of the 18th of April was defined by a series of arrests of local officials. As the day wore on, Boston appeared to be more and more in their control. So the rebels raised an orange flag in the city square. This orange flag, well, it was to represent the Prince of Orange. This was a Williamite rebellion against Governor Andros. Another unit of militia, that half that was still on the other side of the river, rode their way into town and encamped outside the walls of Fort Mary at one of the exits. The first group, those who had been active in Boston all day, did the same at the only other exit to the fort. The people of Boston had Edmund Andros and all of his men trapped inside. Come the morning of the 19th, the people were preparing to storm the barricades. And to his credit, Governor Andros raised the white flag and surrendered. He did so before any men could begin shooting and killing each other. Andros was detained. The people brought him before the restored governor of Massachusetts Bay and his high council. Those men decided to formally arrest Andros. The former governor was detained in a house overnight, and then taken to Fort Mary, which was now in the hands of the rebels. There he stayed for several weeks in the stocks until, one night, his servant arrived and plied the guards with drink until they passed out, which gave Edmund Andros the ability to escape. He made it all the way to Rhode Island before being recaptured. I don't like Edmund Andros, but you gotta feel for him here. He never had a chance. Everyone in New England hated him. Once he was recaptured, Andros was taken to Castle Island and detained there for several weeks more. There's a legend that he put on women's clothing to attempt an escape, but no real historical data backs that up. However, a few weeks later, a ship from England arrived in the harbor. That ship carried some really big news. First, Governor Andros was formally relieved of command. The current governing structure, all of the former pre-Andros governments, were adopted as long as they adhered to English law and paid their taxes. Andros was to be taken back to London. Once he arrived, though, an investigation was undertaken, and all charges against him were dropped. The Williamite government embraced Edmund Andros, and he would live a full and happy life. But that ship also carried word that James Stuart had landed in Ireland. He was at the head of a French army. King William was sailing for Ireland to counter this move. What's more, open warfare had broken out on the continent. Everyone was in need of ships and guns and men. Anyone who had patriotic Williamite leanings or seditious Jacobite leanings began to prepare for a voyage across the Atlantic to join sides with whoever they supported. Now Thomas Pound heard that news alongside everyone else in Boston, but his motivations for what comes next are nearly impossible to determine. There are a ton of different interpretations. Now, I've been working from the analysis done by David F. Marley, which ascribes Jacobite motivations, at least a bitterness he felt towards the Williamites that removed him from power. But there are other interpretations. Some suggest that Thomas Pound was a die-hard Orangist. Others that his plans were for mercenary, piratical purposes. I'm going to try to balance the three moving forward and add in a dash of the myth with what we can verify as fact. The facts of Thomas Pound's story are a little wanting. There's an outline there, sure, but it comes from the people who encountered Thomas Pound on the high seas. A lot of the drama is lost. But if we look instead to a book like The Pirates of the New England Coast by George Francis Dow, we find a lot more color. Dow writes, quote, "In front of the South Station in Boston, there is an intersection of wide streets known as Dewey Square. In 1689, the space was a tidewater, and into it projected Bull's Wharf. On shore, near the head of the wharf, was a tavern with a swinging sign in front displaying on either side a beefy-looking animal that was labeled the Bull. At about 11 o'clock on the night of Thursday, August 8, 1689, 6 men and a boy came down to the water's edge, not far from the tavern, and went on board a 2-masted, half-decked fishing boat of the type known at the time as a Bermuda's boat, and hoisting sails soon disappeared down the harbor in the direction of the castle. The leader of the party was Thomas Pound of the frigate Ruse." End quote. Now, this book is not a source to be trusted as hard scientific fact. Not much of what he said there could be verified, but it really does implant an image in your mind, doesn't it? If we combine something like that with the timing, we can imagine a scene inside the Bull, of men sitting around a table with mugs of ale, or likely of cider, and talking politics. Maybe they decided upon a course of action to aid one of the 2 factions in Ireland, as many other ships were doing. Maybe they had a lead on a privateering commission somewhere in the British Isles. Or Maybe they were saying, to hell with all of this, let's go down to Jamaica where we can drown in wine, women, and Spanish plunder. When we get to all the verifiable stuff, we can say that Thomas Pound and his companions were on board a ship owned by a New England fisherman named Thomas Hawkins. They'd hired Hawkins for a ride to Nantasket, but come the morning of their second day at sea, Pound informed Hawkins that they'd changed their mind. Instead of riding to Nantasket, they wanted to do some fishing. I'll quote George Dow again. He says, quote, "When near Lovell's Island, the sounds of men launching a boat were heard, and one of Pound's men at once said, 'There they are.' And soon after, a small boat with 5 men in it came alongside and boarded Hawkins' boat. These men were armed, and Pound and one of his men, Richard Griffin, a gunsmith, also had brought guns. Pound now took command and ordered the fish casks thrown overboard and directed that an easterly course be made. This soon carried the boat into deep water beyond the Brewster Islands at the entrance to the harbor. He told Hawkins that he and his men had agreed to take the first vessel they met and proceed her to the West Indies to prey on the French." End quote. Again, some of this comes from testimony made by men who were on the ship and others, but some of it doesn't. As far as I can tell, some of this is merely Dow's imagination. In a bid to retain possession of his ship, Thomas Hawkins agreed to join the men and act as a pilot. Their first encounter with another ship was innocuous, but it did raise some eyebrows. I've often heard this called a failure, but I don't think there was any intent to engage in piracy here. They encountered a fishing sloop, and Hawkins pulled his ship up near the sloop, but he did so at an odd angle. He never came up alongside her. Hawkins asked the captain of the sloop to sell them some fish and water, and he did so, but the captain of the sloop noted, quote, 10 or 12 men who seemed to be keeping out of sight, and abaft a man whose body was out of sight was seen to peer at the fishermen, and then quickly drew back. So Captain Prince asked Hawkins where he was bound, and he replied to Billingsgate, and when asked how he had come to be so far to the northward, Hawkins replied, "It's all one to me." End quote. Upon reaching his destination in Boston, the fishing sloop captain went immediately to the governor's office. He reported the strange activities. Now, that captain didn't know who any of these men were, but I have heard it said that the governor of Massachusetts tried to track down Captain Thomas Pound. He wanted him to take the Mary out and hunt these suspicious characters down. Of course, they never found Thomas Pound, but this really wasn't a priority at the time. Their next encounter on the high seas was more like it. The pirates seemed to have gathered a few more men on their voyage before meeting with the ketch Mary near what's called Halfway Rock. The captain of the Mary, Helene Chard, noted some 40 men on the vessel. I should note that this ship was owned by Philip English out of Salem. In 3 years' time, Philip and his wife, Mary English, would be on trial for witchcraft in the Salem witch trials. The pirates captured that ketch, an upgrade to their current vessel, and filled her with men and guns and water. Captain Chard informed the authorities, though, that they only had 2 gallons of powder. That's not much. He also recognized 2 of the men. There was Thomas Hawkins himself, and there was a crewman identified only as, quote, a limping privateer named Johnson. That captain also informed the authorities there in Salem that Hawkins intended to sail south and, quote, plague the French. Now, there's a lot of conversation of sailing south to attack the French here, but this contradicts what other men had to say later on. Someone is lying, but I can't quite sift through all of it. Because, as a lie, it makes sense from every angle. If these men were planning to sail for the West Indies and engage in open piracy, it might sound good to the members of the court if you said you were going to Europe to sail in defense of the king. Or, conversely, if you were sailing for Ireland to join up with the Jacobite forces under King James, you might say you were sailing to plague the French in the West Indies as a legal privateer in the war. Any way you slice it, we're honest, patriotic, God-fearing Englishmen, and I won't have you sully our honor with this slander. Once that ketch was under their control, the pirates put Captain Chard and his men on board their own to sail for home. There were two exceptions to this, however. The pirates took the ship's doctor and a ship's boy who spoke French to translate. About a week later, that ship's doctor arrived in Falmouth, Maine, at the gates of that very same fort which had just mutinied a few months prior. Captain Pound and his ship were nowhere to be seen, and the doctor had this harrowing tale of capture and torture at the hands of the nefarious pirates. The commander of the garrison there took him in and fed him, and gave him a tot of rum. However, he noted that the doctor was acting strangely. He was talking to the soldiers in an oddly affable manner for a man who had just been through so much. So the commander ordered 2 men to keep watch outside his quarters that night. Come morning, though, the doctor was nowhere to be seen at the garrison. Nor were the 2 sentries set to guard him, nor were about a dozen other men. Add to that, there was a ketch down the hill in the harbor. The garrison commander sent out a canoe to demand that they return his men, but he saw there none other than Thomas Pound. The garrison commander at Falmouth, Maine, very much knew who Thomas Pound was. They knew each other personally. They were both military leaders of the New England Dominion, remember? And Captain Pound, when the men were demanded to return, laughed in his face. Instead, the pirates went ashore. They took a calf, they took 2 sheep, and they took several barrels of powder and a few more guns. I like to imagine that Captain Pound knew many of the men that joined him. He knew about the situation at the garrison, the rough treatment that these militiamen underwent, and realized that it would be prime recruiting ground for his pirate crew. This garrison, though, was an important military outpost for the English in Maine. In the war that was brewing, it was going to serve as the very first line of defense that the English had against French and Indian attacks from Canada. And in the very first attack, it would fall amazingly quickly. Now, this has been blamed on Thomas Pound, and yeah, he might have had a couple dozen of her soldiers on his pirate ship, but the garrison was already so poorly managed that they had mutiny after mutiny well before Pound arrived. It's likely they would have capitulated anyway. However, that's where we're going to leave Thomas Pound this week. Now, with a ketch of reasonable size, full stores of powder and guns, and plenty of food and men to engage in a reign of terror across the New England coast for the next several months. We left off last time with Captain Thomas Pound, relieved of his command in the Royal Navy and so recently turned pirate captain. When we left off, he had a crew made up of other former Navymen combined with scoundrels and scallywags. They were on board a newly captured ketch just off the coast of Falmouth, Maine. You'll recall that Thomas Pound, loyal Royal Navy captain, lost his job in the wake of the Glorious Revolution, and he booked passage on board the ship of one Thomas Hawkins. Then he commandeered the ship only to have Hawkins join his crew. Then Pound captured an armed merchant ketch and released their crew. Except for the ship's boy who spoke French, they were reportedly going to attack the French in the West Indies, and the ship's doctor. Then that doctor assisted the pirates. This captive, captured only a few days prior, went ashore at the Falmouth garrison to recruit for the pirates. I've been mulling that event over. More and more, I think there is something really important there. That doctor, captured just a week ago, waltzed into the garrison under the pretense of having escaped the pirates. George Dow writes in Pirates of the New England Coast, quote, "It was noticed that the doctor, after he came back from the catch, was much in conversation with the soldiers belonging to the fort, which aroused the suspicions of the commander." End quote. The doctor appears to have been acting, playing the role of a captured victim of nefarious pirates. He appears to have done so to mislead the garrison commander and lure away the disaffected soldiers, which, that's awesome, but why did he do that? If he were, in fact, a victim of torture and brutality as he claimed to the commander, why did he do what he did? This was, I will remind you, an English frontier fort that was gearing up for war. They had men and guns and powder. It was the place, literally, the best place outside of maybe Boston or Salem. That was the best place for this victim to escape his captors. But that's not what he did. He did the opposite. And having been captured only a week earlier, that's not enough time for Stockholm Syndrome to kick in. They didn't have time to, find and threaten the doctor's family or what have you. The doctor was clearly working with the pirates of his own volition, but why? Well, I don't have an answer. What we have comes from a report filed by that commander, who was just as perplexed as I am, and a book written in 1923. I do have a few guesses, though. We could ascribe Jacobite leanings or Catholic sympathies or any other ideology that would suggest he supported King James. Some of that might go to explain the doctor's actions, but that's really big picture stuff. If we shrunk it down to a local level, maybe the doctor was upset by one or another aspect of local politics. They were contentious after all. But while I do love to diagnose the motivations of historic figures through the lens of politics, and, while that is sometimes valid, in the case of this doctor, on board the pirate ship of Captain Thomas Pound, I think the most likely motivations were personal. Just, hey, we're going to go down south and get rich beyond our wildest dreams and laze our days away on tropical beaches. Do you want in? Oh, and by the way, as the doctor, you won't have to do any fighting, and you'll get an equal share of all the plunder. We'll even kick in a bit extra. But the doctor, alongside Thomas Hawkins and Thomas Pound and the rest of the crew, were never going to realize those dreams. This is episode 168, A Bloody Flag. Okay, I'd like to be clear here. This episode was supposed to be titled Thomas Pound Part 2. When you release an episode called Thomas Pound Part 1, that's a promise of a Part 2. And it kind of is Thomas Pound Part 2, but I'm not calling it that for reasons that will soon become clear. After the garrison commander rode out to the ketch and demanded his men be returned, after Thomas Pound, who, remember, he personally knew, laughed in his face and went ashore to steal sheep and powder and water and shot, the ketch of Thomas Pound set out to sea. What followed was the sort of flurry of piracy that legends are made of. The pirates set sail for the south. On the 16th of August, 1689, about a week after leaving Falmouth, the pirates came upon the sloop Good Hope. She was a sleek, well-built vessel, a fast vessel. Smaller than a frigate, but an ideal pirate ship for the crew that they had. The Good Hope was lying at anchor just off Race Point. That's at almost the very tip of the hook of Cape Cod. Good Hope was probably anchored in Hatch's Harbor for the night when a boat full of pirates rowed over and boarded her. Now, there was no violence done in capturing the ship. The captain of Good Hope, a man named John Smart, surrendered as soon as he realized what was going on. The pirates transferred over all of their guns and their goods and their tackle, everything they needed, onto the sloop. They gave their ketch over to Captain Smart and his men. This was the second time that they had upgraded ships without any overt violence being done, and that's exactly how you want things to go for a new pirate crew. They're recruiting men, they're collecting guns, they're stockpiling victuals and tackle and powder, and all the while they're getting better and better ships. but they set the captured crews free with a ship and plenty of food and water to get back to Boston or Salem. That's exactly how we, as observers, and the pirates themselves, want their early careers to go. It wasn't peaceful by any means. There was the threat of imminent violence and a sense of menace that the pirates, and really Thomas Pound himself, instilled in their captured crews. Pound had that certain sense of theatricality, a flair for the dramatic that makes really the very best of the pirates. I mean, he's no Blackbeard, but listen to this. When Good Hope and the Ketch were ready to part ways, when Captain Smart and his men were fully aware that they were going to be let go, Pound gave them a message to carry to Boston. He said, according to Captain Smart, quote, "Tell there that they know ye government sloop lay ready, but if she came out after them and came up with them, they should find hot work, for they would die every man before they could be taken." End quote. Now that message is playing the pronoun game particularly hard, in part because it's a message and partly because 17th century English speakers forgot how to speak the language for a while. What Smart is saying, Pound was saying, is that they knew a government ship was being ready to come and hunt them. Of course, Thomas Pound would know that better than almost anyone in New England, since he had personally commanded a ship that did just that. But Pound continued that if the governor did insist on sending out the ship, they would find hot work. He says that they would die to a man rather than be taken, which, of course, means that victory for any English vessel would not be certain. The governor of Massachusetts was indeed going to send a ship out after the pirates. There were two pieces of news that reached him almost simultaneously. Captain Smart delivered his message, and that garrison commander from Falmouth sent a messenger confirming that, yes, this was in fact Royal Navy Captain Thomas Pound. Now, I have to avoid drawing too many parallels to the American Revolution. See, this is Boston, after all. For example, the Maine wharf there at Boston in 1689 was supplied from a garrison just up the hill. It was a naval and militia bunker on the hill. It was Bunker Hill. The sloop that the governor sent out after Thomas Pound came from the Charlestown shipyards. Today, that's the home of the USS Constitution. But it wasn't yet the Charlestown shipyards, not officially, not until the Revolution, but it was a shipyard in Charlestown. Still, Massachusetts sent out a colonial sloop called Resolution under a captain named Thomas Baxter. He ventured out into the Massachusetts Bay, then into the Cape Cod Bay to hunt down Thomas Pound. Baxter had 40 men and orders from the governor of Massachusetts to, quote, "strenuously endeavor the suppressing and seizing of all pirates, especially one Thomas Hawkins, Pound, and other confederated with them." These orders continue that Baxter was to be, quote, "very careful and avoid the shedding of blood unless you be necessitated by resistance and opposition made against you." End quote. Captain Baxter would fail in that mission. He never even spotted Good Hope's sails on the horizon. However, he followed the pirates' tracks like some kind of naval detective, and it's his reports that give us the best outline we have of Thomas Pound's activities. A few days after the pirates captured Good Hope, Thomas Hawkins went ashore on Cape Cod to collect meat, salt, wood, and water. While on shore, they killed 4 shoats, which I had to Google because I am a city boy. A shoat is just a young pig. No longer weaning, not a suckling pig, but not yet fully grown. Baxter tells us that the owner of those shoats came out to chase the bandits off, only to find 12 heavily armed pirates staring him down in the midst of butchering his hogs. But I wonder how true that is. It probably is true, but it's possible that the pirates just bought the pigs, much like they bought fish a few weeks earlier. If that were the case, you can imagine the farmer panicking a bit when a Navy sloop came calling to ask about this pirate menace. After all, trading with pirates was punishable by death due to a royal decree. Oh yeah, real mean-looking characters, guns and swords and scars on all of them. I don't know why that turned immediately into a Minnesota accent, except that I can't do Cape Cod. I was going for kind of a Stephen King movie Maine thing, but no, it turned into Fargo. Anyway, you get the idea. But the next lead that Thomas Baxter came across led him to what he called Martin's Vineyard. But of course he means Martha's Vineyard. He had to travel all the way around Cape Cod into Vineyard Sound. There, Captain Baxter encountered a brigantine named the Merrimac, John Kent, master. Kent had quite a story to tell him. On the 27th of August, 1689, a sloop approached the Merrimac in Martha's Vineyard Sound. John Kent tells us that she raised, quote, a bloody flag. I want to pause here for a second to talk about flags. A general history of the murders and robberies of the most notorious pirates by Captain Charles Johnson is generally accepted to be the first text to use the term Jolly Roger in reference to a pirate flag. But this right here, this event some 30 years before the publication of Johnson's work, is the first reference I can think of a bloody flag, in at least the Western Hemisphere. Now, we've seen examples of French pirates and privateers flying red flags in the West Indies before this point. At Panama, under Henry Morgan in 1671, there was a French captain who flew a red standard. On the Pacific adventures, there were French commanders who flew red flags. And the French had a name for that flag. And it appears that in French martial culture, which was kind of synonymous with European martial culture, a red flag had an acknowledged use as a colored flag in a time of war. When you don't have an official standard, certain flags can represent intentions. A white flag means surrender. Insert a joke about the French here. A red flag, though, symbolizes danger. It still does, really. What do we call warning signs in our relationships? We call them red flags. More specifically, though, a red flag on a battlefield said, "We intend to attack you. Danger." The French called their flag Joli Rouge. That translates to a pretty red or maybe a lovely red. I think that says something about French martial culture and Elan, that they considered this symbol of impending violence to be lovely. Many historians argue, quite convincingly, that the Joli Rouge is the origin of the term Jolly Roger. And I think that's probably right. But I've mentioned before the Sali Rouge. That was a red flag so famously flown by the Sali rovers of Morocco. In a maritime sense, when Navy men saw a red flag, they thought of the Sali Rouge. Especially Navy men who had been to the Mediterranean, those who had encountered pirates and piracy off the coast of Barbary. Much like Royal Navalman Thomas Pound, who served on a mission to Sallee in which the English captured the Sally Rose, which Pound himself went on to captain. Thomas Pound saw the Sally Rouge flying from the mast of his own ship before he took command of her. I doubt that it's a coincidence that this Royal Naval captain, when he eventually turned pirate, gives us our first, I'm going to amend that, probably our first, as long as I'm not forgetting something or overlooking something blatantly obvious, but probably our first English reference to a bloody flag. Did I couch that enough to be safe? I can say that even if this is the very first written record of a bloody flag in English, mariners of the day were well aware of its meaning already. John Kent, the captain of the Merrimac, immediately knew that these men were pirates. When Good Hope came up alongside the Merrimac, the deck of the pirate ship was bristling with men all holding guns and sabers and screaming the most vicious kinds of taunts and threats. Thomas Pound, the captain, approached the rail and ordered the master, John Kent, to come aboard Good Hope. This is the nightmare scenario for any honest, law-abiding sea captain. John Kent told Captain Thomas Baxter, a couple of weeks later, that those pirates forced him to capitulate and stole barrels of flour and sugar and rum and tobacco. They did this while holding his crew hostage at sword point. Kent himself was held hostage aboard the Good Hope in the captain's quarters. Now this is probably how it happened. I have no good reason to question John Kent's relation of events here. Take that right up front. Pirates did this stuff all the time. It's what makes them pirates. But I kind of still do question it. Rather, I acknowledge the possibility that John Kent could have been lying just like that farmer back on Cape Cod. If he were lying, he would be doing so for the very same reasons as that farmer, the possibility of a horrible execution at the Boston gallows. But this capture of the Merrimac was the last piece of evidence that Captain Thomas Baxter came across. From there, the trail went cold. Shortly after the capture of the Merrimac and after setting the crew and the ship free, Good Hope was hit by a powerful nor'easter. It blew the Good Hope deep out into the Atlantic Ocean. When the storm finally subsided and Good Hope was able to set sail for land, they made their first landfall in Virginia, far to the south of where they had been. The Good Hope was limping. Thanks to the storm, it had a lot of damage, so the crew put in at an isolated cove in the James River, far from any English habitation. The pirates spent several days careening their ship, and they weren't alone at this isolated cove. There was another sloop that arrived the next day, but she wasn't a threat either, hiding in that cove for the same reason as the pirates, maybe a smuggler or the like. Now we know about their time spent here on the James River thanks to the word of two brave sailors. As word of Thomas Pound and the pirate menace he presented spread, notices began to pop up in every English port city along the Atlantic seaboard. They were advising citizens to be on the lookout for the Good Hope and the pirates Thomas Hawkins and Thomas Pound. In Jamestown, Virginia, two men came forward with information: John Giddings and Edward Brown. They recognized the descriptions of the pirates from a transaction only about a week past. Now I called these two men brave, and their actions here were, but I did not call them noble. They were unsavory characters. They had on board their skiff a number of kidnapped slaves, stolen from a local plantation. On no level is that great. There's of course the slave trading, which was legal at the time, but morally reprehensible in every conceivable fashion. But the kidnapping aspect of it was absolutely illegal. What they did was a crime to both our modern eyes and the people at the time. But I would like to mention the way that they very likely kidnapped those slaves. That makes it all even worse. There was a tactic utilized by many smugglers and illicit slave traders in which they conspired with the slaves themselves. They offered to help those slaves escape. If you let it become known that you're an abolitionist, someone who has maybe secret roots to a maroon colony or what have you, that word will begin to spread. It will spread among the slaves in the region, and it's not like they're going to rat you out, not their one lifeline to freedom. But then, once that rumor has spread throughout the community, you let it be known that the time has come. Your ship is waiting for them, just down the hill in this cove. That tactic means that those slaves will do all of the work for you. You do the work of drinking in taverns and spreading rumors to the right people, but it's the slaves that formulate a plan and slip away under cover of darkness and extreme personal danger. Those slaves will naturally make their way to your waiting ship, only to find that once they are aboard, nope, they're still slaves. Only now they're ripped away from the only community that they've ever known, assuming that they were born on the plantation, which in 1689 was pretty likely. They were to be sold far, far away from that community to nefarious characters. What made this so gutting was the emotional rope-a-dope of it, the promise of freedom dangled before them and then ripped away. The reason that the buyers were so often nefarious characters was because this was a black market transaction. It was illegal. Now, here on the Pirate History Podcast, I'd love to be able to tell you that those nefarious characters were actually a step up for the enslaved people. And sometimes, especially later on, that would be the case. There were those pirates who, in the vein of fictitious pirates like Jack Sparrow or Charles Vane from Black Sails, those who had a genuine ethical and emotional objection to the institution of slavery. There were others with less moral standing who were just capturing ships for sugar or indigo or silver or what have you, but they often took the slaves as well, and not necessarily to sell them. It wasn't a sense of empathy or righteousness. They just stole those slaves to give a big screw you to the effete pricks who treated them so badly before they became pirates. Oftentimes, it was a mixture of both those attitudes. Yeah, slavery's terrible, so are the masters. This is a 1-2 punch. Even if the pirates had desired to sell those slaves in the latter days of the Republic of Pirates, they were unable to. More often, they took those slaves to one of the maroon colonies on the Maine or deep in the hills of places like Jamaica. Those very colonies would often offer the pirates succor in this sea of enemies, and they did so for this work. And of course, that might have been part of it as well. They were offered food and comfort and, let's be real here, more or less willing women. That's a good payment for freeing slaves that you happened to come across while stealing cargo from the Spanish. And that's a great story. I'm really excited to tell that story. We're getting to the point in our overall story where that sea change is going to take place, but we're not there yet. When John Giddings and Edward Brown came forward to tell the authorities about that transaction with Thomas Pound, they were clear. They stole those slaves, likely by the method that I laid out, but they sold one of them to the Good Hope pirates. Here in 1689, Thomas Pound and these pirates did not buy this slave to free them. Now, we don't know much about the slave they bought. We don't even know whether they were a man or a woman. Either way, though, the work to which they would have been put would have been awful. But this information set the colony of Virginia into action. They sent out several ships north to work in conjunction. They used an interesting tactic here. Their fastest vessel set out to race the Good Hope up north. If they caught the Good Hope, they could try to capture or kill the pirates, but at the very least they would be able to inform the Massachusetts governing body of the news. The other ships weren't going to move as quickly. They were going to scour the coves and the rivers for any sign of the pirates, but they were going to do so in kind of a piggyback fashion. While one ship was searching inland, the other would race by and get to the next cove, then the ship behind it would race by and get to the cove after that. It ensured that they left no stone unturned while moving at a relatively fast pace. But of course all of these ships were sailing north. None of them went to the south. That's just the reality of Atlantic wind patterns. All the ships had to follow that clockwork pattern, from Virginia to New England to Newfoundland to England proper, down to Africa and all the way back across to the West Indies. And that, of course, included Thomas Pound's Good Hope. Whatever he intended for the future of his pirate venture, it had been thrown into disarray when his ship was blown out to sea by that nor'easter. That pushed him to the south, and even if he was intending to sail to the West Indies to attack the French, as he so often told the people that he captured, even though that put him geographically closer to his destination, it extended his journey by many, many leagues. From their cove on the James River, Thomas Pound had to sail back north to New England. Which wasn't great. He had to sail back to New England a few weeks after having committed several dastardly acts of piracy in the region. New England was up in arms at these acts, literally. There were a ton of armed ships out searching for him, many of them volunteer vessels, not Royal or Colonial Navy. There was a price on Thomas Pound's head, and everyone was hoping to collect. That, in September of 1689, is what Thomas Pound and Thomas Hawkins and all the rest of the crew were sailing into. I'd like to thank everybody for listening. I'd like to thank everybody who has helped to support the show, everybody who has signed up to become a patron on Patreon, anyone who has left us a rating or a review wherever you listen to the show, everybody who has donated through the website, and everybody who has recommended this show to your friends and family, online or in real life. All of you make it possible. Thank you. Our theme music was, as usual, The Old Captain by the fantastic band Brillig. If you haven't checked them out yet, you absolutely should do so. You can find them at brillig.com.au, that's brillig.com.au. After you're done over there, why not check out our website at piratehistorypodcast.com. As always, most importantly, thank you for listening.